So, what's up people and welcome to the Mission 101 discussion of Spy Family. So Mission 101 came out just recently, and as always I will leave a link to this mission that's currently being shown on the publisher's official website, Manga Plus, for free to the North American audience. So if you're interested, we'll go take a look at it before they pull this mission back. Okay, so if you recall, in Mission 100, we saw Martha leaving Annabelle's house. And we continue on in 101 with this flashback regarding Martha and Henry. And I did like this chapter, but in a different way from many of the other chapters regarding this particular flashback, and I'll go over that a little bit later. But we continue on with the journey of Martha going home. Now what we find out in this chapter is that if you recall, Martha was shot and then fell into the river and later on was found by Annabelle. Well, what we find out is that she went downstream quite a bit before she was discovered by Annabelle, and I guess that was the reason why she was able to escape from the Westalis soldiers. But because of that, her trip back has become quite tedious. It's going to take a little bit of time to travel all the way back, and because this is war and she is in enemy territory, she has to be careful about getting caught. And of course, as she gets closer to the border, she is basically getting towards the front line where the battle is. So the closer she gets to her own country, the more difficult it becomes. And by this time, she has run out of food. And what she's found out is that even though she has money, she can't really use it because when she tries to buy something, all these stores request identification that she doesn't have. And so now she is starving and she is still trying to figure out how to get by, worried that eventually somebody's going to catch her and identify her as a Ostanian soldier. And she recalls the Westalis soldiers that came after her, and she never wanted to experience that again. And being a woman becomes a dangerous target to many of the soldiers that are around, and so she decides that she is going to mask her identity as much as possible by cutting her hair and pretending to be a man. She does find some male clothing, and lowering her voice, she feels that she can somehow get back without being identified as Martha. But even under this disguise, it becomes very difficult. Sometimes she gets called upon through a conversation and she has to work very hard to avoid people thinking that she has a Ostanian accent. So she starts traveling a lot more off-road, trying to find any sort of scrap of food that she can, and basically sleeping in the forest to avoid capture. And because she had this strong desire to get back, most probably because of Henry, she kept on persevering to try to get to the border. But considering the distance was so severe, you eventually see her laid out in the ground, no longer being able to move. And she feels that she is very close to the front now, but no matter how far she goes, she can't seem to find that border. And that's really starting to make her almost want to give up. But at that point, all of a sudden, a truck comes with a group of soldiers, and it turns out to be Westalis soldiers, and of course that immediately amplifies her survival instincts. And they recognize her as somebody from Ostania. And one of the soldiers points a gun and decides that maybe he should just kill this person. But then all of a sudden, the other soldiers tell him to just put down the gun. It's not worth killing that person anymore because the war is over. Which is of course the first time Martha hears this, and she is absolutely surprised by the news. And so of course the Westalis soldiers don't particularly save her, they don't kill her, and they go driving off, and of course she is left on her own. But because she heard that the war is over, it kind of ignited a newfound desire for her to get over the border. And with some form of miracle, she does get across the border and finally collapses once again. This time definitely no longer able to move, but she is recognized by a traveling band of Ostanian soldiers who pick her up and put her in the truck. And it turns out that these soldiers are moving around trying to gather people like her who have fallen during the war. And so she realizes that all of these people that are in the truck with her are just like her, people who have basically fallen during that battle. And she gets befriended by this gentleman who says, "Hey, aren't you Martha? I thought that your entire group was wiped out, but I'm really glad to see that you are alive." And he offers her some water and tells her to cheer up because now they are saved. But it's at that time that one of the other soldiers basically starts sarcastically saying, "What are you cheerful about? We didn't win, nor did we lose," which basically seems like the two countries came to a stalemate, a ceasefire, if you will. And the war ended not because one of the countries was victorious, but because neither countries had any ability to fight anymore. And this soldier continues on. What was the point of his fighting? What was the reason for this entire situation if neither country was in any better shape due to this war? And this other gentleman says, well, regardless of whether who won or lost, at least what they did was able to give the country enough defense to keep many of the citizens alive. Because of what they've done, many of the cities, including Berlin, where Martha came from, was still basically unscathed from the war. And Martha had to smile and agree to that it was due to their efforts that many of the cities in Ostania were saved. But in her mind, she felt that that was somewhat an excuse that she had to make just for herself to feel that what she did had some sort of purpose. And if she didn't feel that way, then it would literally destroy her because she would no longer know exactly what she risked her life for. And so she continues to talk to Paul, and the two become somewhat familiar. But what we find out is that although they were rescued, they're not really treated all that well. They're just being transported to the hometown where they came from. And since Berlin is the farthest away, they have to wait quite a bit of time during this travel. And although Martha was initially very happy to be rescued, her strength was slowly dying away trying to get home. And it was only due to Paul and his continuous offering of water that somehow she was able to get through. And out of all the things that Paul asks, he asks whether she is in a relationship and maybe they should get together. And as much as Martha appreciated the offer, she tells him that she already has someone she cares for very much. And Paul, taking it very well, says, well, then that's more of a reason why you need to stay alive to get home. Which is a very ironic situation, knowing the status of Henry at the moment. And eventually, they do get to Berlin. And Martha becomes really relieved that they finally got home. And she went to tell Paul, who was lying asleep, to wake up because they were finally home. But when she does, she finds out that it wasn't that Paul was asleep, but he had passed away during the night. Although he had helped others to somehow make it back home, he himself didn't have the energy to make it all the way home. And sitting next to Paul's dead body, Martha starts crying and realizing just how unfair life was. But of course, for all of the other people there was no room for sympathy. Everybody had their own sad stories that they had to deal with, and knowing that, Martha finally gets up and gets out of the train. And that's where we end this particular chapter. Now, what I wanted to talk about was why I found this chapter to be very interesting but very different from the others. And in fact, many of the commenters who read this chapter kind of fell into two sides. One side was continuing the criticism with regards to why Tatsuya Endo was writing this flashback so long. These weren't even the main characters, and yet Tatsuya Endo was spending way more time in this flashback than even compared to the Lloyd flashback. But as I read this particular chapter, I felt that I understood what Tatsuya Endo wanted to do. Although this flashback was mostly about Martha and Henry and their relationship, this particular chapter really didn't have much to do with Martha herself. This particular flashback was written with regards to the war. I think Tatsuya Endo wanted to show the people, once again, the world building, but more importantly, the difficulties of war. And rather than show it from a third-person perspective, he chose Martha to be the narrator of the experiences from a soldier during this war. And so although it is Martha once again, this particular chapter is not written with regards to Martha so that we understand much more about her life, although this part of her experience probably does build her character once more. Most of this chapter was our ability to see the world of Ostania and Westalis and the devastations of war through the eyes of Martha. And I think that's why Tatsuya Endo spent this chapter and lengthened her time to get back just to give us this information. If it was just about Martha, it would have been easier just to start this chapter where Martha finally reaches home. But by doing it the way he did, it gave us the ability to learn more about the world. And I know a lot of people don't care about the world. They only care about the relationship of Anya, Lloyd, and Yor. And many of the criticisms came back that they just want to see the happy family continue on with their happy, funny lives and stop messing around with this dark story that shouldn't be here in a story about a happy family. But for me, once again, the happy family is important, but the happiness of the family is very important because it is entwined in a world that is actually quite dark. And by giving us the glimpse of just how devastating the previous wars were, we start to understand why it is so important for people like Twilight, Sylvia Sherwood, and others to prevent yet another war from coming out. And I think this is very important to show through the eyes of both Martha and Henry Henderson, because although it's about Twilight and, of course, his family and Operation Strix, it is the experiences of these other characters around him and their own experiences and how devastating war was that will probably create their character to make certain decisions later on with regards to Operation Strix. There's most likely a situation where eventually Twilight, Yor, and even Anya's identity may eventually come out. And if that becomes public, there will be some very interesting responses from the characters around them. By giving us this sort of information, not only do we understand what's at stake because of the world building, but we also start understanding the characters and why they may act a certain way later on. And so I feel that these sorts of chapters are important to build up the story and give it the depth and weight that's necessary for the future chapters coming down the line. Yes, I like the funny Anya antics, and I like the funny family wholesome situations, but it's because it's entwined in this story that their family relationship becomes very, very important. Without that, it doesn't give the depth and grounding of the relationship and the perils that they may experience later on. And so I really enjoyed the story, not because of the Henry-Martha relationship for this chapter, but because it gave so much information with regards to the world. And so now, whatever the case, Martha is finally back home. And it will be interesting to see how Tatsuya Endo moves this story further. And I do look forward to the next chapter coming out. And once it does, I'll bring out another video. I hope you join me at that time. But this is the Mission 101 discussion of Spy Family. If you read it, what'd you think about it? Any comments will be greatly appreciated. And until the next episode, happy manga reading, and as always, Jaya, nice day everyone.